Well, Hungary.
Oh, Hungary.
Never mind.
Did we want to know.
It is now Romania. It was Hungary.
Okay.
It changed. I'll explain in a minute.
And we want to know, did you ever meet Elie Wiesel?
No, I did not. Unfortunately, when I was supposed to meet him, he was very ill. I never did meet him.
Katie is here to...
He comes from a town which is about as close as Concord to here, to my town, yeah.
Wow.
We ate the same food, we breathed the same air, and we were getting killed by the same people.
I'm going to let Katie begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, yeah, you need to get music guy. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. I'm sorry about that. Thank you. Hi, guys. Hi. I'll try not to bore you today, okay? And you know, when people think, oh, a Holocaust survivor is coming to talk, they'll think, oh, some old lady's going to cry. Well, I don't cry, so it's okay. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. That's a big difference. The reason that I speak is there are less and less of us who survived, you know. I've become part of history. Most people who are in camps are dead already, you know. And there's a few child survivors, which I was. I was never in a camp, but I was a hidden child and I was persecuted. And I love speaking to middle schools. To tell you the truth, 8th grade is my favorite age group because you're like half angels and half devils. And even the worst boy has some angel in him. And I say boy because the boys come in swaggering much more than the girls, right? All these macho people. But I really feel that you guys have a lot of compassion left in you, and there's an element of acceptance which isn't there as you get older. When you get to high school, you're too cool to do anything. I come from a small town in what is Transylvania. You know where the vampires come from? That's the place I was born, and it was Hungary when I was persecuted, and now it's Romania. It keeps changing through history. That area goes from one to the other. And the small town that I lived in was a very nice town. And you know, everything was okay because when the economy is good, people don't hate each other as much. And there were theaters, and there was even an opera house, which was close to my house. And there was a river that went through the town, and there were lots of movie houses and churches and synagogues, and there was a lot of commerce. It wasn't that far from Budapest, which was the capital, and it was a very vibrant little town. I come from a very odd family. My mother was Catholic and my father was Jewish, and it wasn't done in those days. They were promptly disowned by both families, you know. And my mother converted to Judaism to please my father's very large Jewish family, but they were not really religious. And I remember my mother did the whole thing, you know, Friday night, lighting candles with a scarf over her head. And I was, what, 4 at the time, and I remember thinking she was doing magic, and I wanted to learn how to do magic too. I didn't understand what she was muttering there. And my parents' occupation was, my mother was a dressmaker. In those days, people didn't buy clothes in a shop. You would buy a piece of cloth and go to a dressmaker and have it made. And she had 40 girls working for her, which meant that she was rather, prosperous, but she worked very hard. And my father wholesaled fish. He had great big crates in the river with live fish in it, and he would wholesale it to all the different shops. And they were carp, you know, the fish with sort of long whiskers, and great big things. And I remember as a child there was always one swimming in the bath because we ate a lot of carp. And I used to feel very sorry for these things, and I would go and talk to the fish, and I would say, look, I'm very sorry we're going to eat you, but you're going to taste so good. I felt it would cheer it up, you know. And I had an absolutely golden childhood. I had everything, you know. I was an only child. I was born when my parents were 30 and 40, which was quite late for a child in those days. And I had the most beautiful clothes, and I had a room like you wouldn't believe. It had silk wall hangings, and I had a bed like a princess, and I was always beautifully dressed, and my hair was always nice. And I was paraded in front of people, and they were patting me on the head, telling me how beautiful and clever I was. And of course I believed it, and I was a little princess in my little kingdom. And my parents didn't want to deprive me of Christmas, so I was allowed to have a Christmas tree. And we had very high ceilings. We would have this Christmas tree all the way up to the ceiling with little candles, you know, real candles, and they would light the real candles, and every Christmas we had a fire, because you know what a candle will do to a fir tree. And there was buckets of water next to the tree. They would throw it on, and we always had a Christmas fire, but it was fun. I liked Christmas. And one of the maids took me to the local church to show me the nativity scene, and I stole baby Jesus. Stuck him under my coat and came home, and my mother takes my coat off and she says, "Oh my God, they're going to say the Jews are stealing Jesus. You better get back to that church immediately and apologize." And I took Jesus back to the church, and there was this very tall, very skinny priest. I remember he had a nose like a toucan. I've never seen anything like it. And this very long, bony finger that he was waving at me, telling me that I would go to hell because I stole baby Jesus. And I stood there and I said, "I'm very sorry, I'll never do it again." But to tell you the truth, every time I go past one of those things, I'm still very tempted. Just because, you know. And at this point, my parents decided that I was a completely out of control 4.5-year-old, and they had to get me a governess. Well, the Romanian speakers in our town would have a French governess, and the Hungarian speakers would have a German-speaking governess, and that's what I got. I got Fräulein. Fräulein was Austrian, and she was very strict. She had a mouth like a slash, and a bun on her head, and she was ramrod straight, and she made my life utter misery. I must say, though, that she did teach me in 6 months to read, write, and speak German. So, you know, she must have done something right. But it was very difficult. Like, for instance, I would have to have hard-boiled eggs under my armpits so that I wouldn't flap my arms when I ate. And she tied a ruler behind my back with a string around my neck and one around my waist so that I would sit straight. But you see, it worked. I have good posture. But also, I was never allowed to eat on the street. I mean, you just didn't do that. And when I complained to my parents, I said, "Look, I'm not happy. I don't like this woman. She's mean." And they would say, "No, you don't understand. If you want to be a good girl from a good family, you have to have a proper education. And Fräulein knows best." And Fräulein made me wear gloves and a hat when we went out, and I wasn't allowed to play with the local kids anymore because they weren't white. And oh, she would read me, you know, the Grimm Brothers stories. Any of you read those? I think they should be banned. I think that child abuse about little kids who have their fingers chopped off because their nails are too long, and a little girl who gets burnt up because she plays with matches. Terrible, terrifying stories. I mean, this woman was a bitch. I'm sorry. She was. She made my life. I'm sure they heard this word on the school bus, so there's nothing new I'm teaching them. Right? It's amazing what you can learn on the bus. Anyhow, so Fräulein would only let me play with one person who was a little boy up the street whose parents were rich, and I was allowed to play with the rich boy because that was okay. His name was Istvanko. Stefan Istvanko is like a nickname for Stefan. And he had big blonde curly hair and big blue eyes, and he was absolutely adorable. And the game was running up and down in front of the circular driveway of of the opera house, and the game was, if I caught him, I kissed him. And I caught him a lot. I learned to run very fast, and he hated it. I still remember he would rub his poor little face, you know. He probably hated girls, but that's too bad. But I loved him. I thought it was great. And, you know, basically, he was my only friend. And the center of my universe was my daddy. I loved my father. And any of you girls who have a relationship like that with your father know what I'm talking about. When I sat in his lap and he would talk to me, the security and the love I felt, it has I've never been able to recapture it. It was absolutely wonderful. And he was a nice man. He was tall and dark, and he would throw me up in the air and catch me. And he always wore a very flamboyant white scarf. And he always had something in his pocket for me when he came home, whether it was a sweet or a card or a flower. He always had something for me. I was always waiting for him to come and look in his pocket. And in those days, children were not being discussed with, you know. You would tell the child, go here, go there, don't do this, don't do that. He always explained to me. He was always very kind and very patient. And he would give me money when I went for walks with Fräulein. And he said, you have to give all this money to the poor. And I said, well, what if they don't need it? And he says, it doesn't matter, it's not for you to judge. If somebody's begging, you give them the money because you're fortunate, but you're no better than any of those beggars. You have to remember that you happen to be fortunate because of your parents, but you're the same as everybody else. And I still feel that that was a very advanced way of teaching a child in those days, you know. He was a good man, he really was. And he used to teach me all about the stars. I still know every constellation in Hungarian, for what it's worth. But it's his kindness that I really missed later. And we used to have these huge Jewish family gatherings. I mean, there was 28 members in that family, and they would have a long table, almost as long as the stage. And you know what families are like, arguing, and this one isn't talking to that one, and that one isn't talking to this one, and it was noisy. And I was the youngest, and everybody was patting me on the head, telling me how wonderful I was. And I had all these cousins and aunts and uncles. And it was great fun. I really enjoyed it. And at this point, my parents decided that I should have some kind of idea of my heritage. So they sent me to a Jewish kindergarten twice a day. And I don't remember much about it. They were singing little songs. But the thing is, Stefan was there, my friend, so I could torment him, so that was good. And then life started to change. You know, people often say, well, why didn't the Jews do something about it? It didn't happen suddenly. It was a gradual thing, you know. It's a little bit like bullying, you know, push here, a push there. First, we weren't allowed to go to university anymore. And then Jews weren't allowed to go to high school. And then slowly we weren't allowed to go to elementary school either. You had to go to a Jewish school. You were not allowed to be seen by a doctor who wasn't Jewish. And eventually, no woman under the age of 45 was allowed to work for a Jewish family. So a lot of the people who worked for us disappeared. People were sort of disappearing. And, you know, I wasn't aware of it at the time. But the mood changed, you know. My mother would walk around with red eyes, crying, and I would say, what's the matter? And they said, oh, don't worry, everything is fine. And of course, when nobody under the age of 45 could work for us, Fräulein left, and I was so happy. I didn't wash my hands for 3 days. I was so happy when she left. And at this point, my mother came to see me, and she said, I have a present for you. And she brought me this beautiful big yellow star made of shiny gold material. And she sewed it on my coat. And I was so terribly proud of this star. I mean, little girls like shiny things, and this star was very, very pretty. And she said, let's go get some pastries. And she took me by the hand, and we're walking down the street. And a man comes opposite, and he stops, and he looks at me. And I look up at him, expecting compliments about my star. And he spits in my face, and the spit runs down my face, onto the star, and I'm horrified. It never occurred to me that he hated me. I thought he hated stars. And I said to my mother, he hates, she just pulled me away. And I said, but Mom, do something. He hates stars. And then she dragged me home quietly. And she said to me, shh, don't say anything. It's not the stars he hates, it's you he hates because you're a Jew. And I couldn't understand. I still didn't believe that. I thought, oh, the man just hates stars, you know. And the Hungarian authorities were very clever about their persecution. What they did is they had all the Jews register with the police so they knew where everybody lived, because they said it was for their own protection. And you know, in all fairness, I've never met a German Nazi. Throughout my whole childhood, it was all Hungarians who persecuted us. You know, our neighbors, people we knew. And then they decided to build a ghetto. You know, the word ghetto is Italian, and it comes from the Middle Ages in Venice. It means foundry, a metal foundry. And they had an area in Venice, which was an old foundry where the Jews were allowed to live. And they were interned there. They weren't allowed to go out at night, only during the day. And the word ghetto has unfortunately become a word for horrible things now. And I remember the day that they started rounding up the Jews. I was watching from the window, and it all happened very suddenly. There were carts and trucks and soldiers and a lot of screaming and yelling, and they were pushing people around and slapping people around and getting people onto these vehicles and taking them away. And my father was going to the ghetto, and he was standing next to my mother. They were holding each other, sobbing, and he had a little suitcase. And I kind of took part in this because I wanted to be part of it, and I cried too, but I wasn't worried because my daddy would never leave me, of course, and he would come back. He would go on business trips, and that was just another thing, you know. And suddenly everybody was gone. And you know, they took the people so fast that they didn't have time to make arrangements for their pets. And there were all these poor dogs running around everywhere. And you know, hungry dogs and cats. And I was very upset about that. Being a little girl, I understood that much more than I understood the human element. And what happened is a dog catcher came and took all these poor animals away. And my mother decided to keep me at home. I was supposed to go too. Excuse me, Gary, can you get my water open, please? Sorry, guys. I was supposed to go to the ghetto because even if you had one Jewish grandparent, you were supposed to die. And my mother, who was Catholic, didn't have to go, but I had to. And of course, they knew I wasn't there, so I was in danger of being found out. So my mother hid me under a bed, and she says, no matter what happens, you stay here, you're not here, I'm going to keep you safe. And I hated it because I wasn't allowed to go out, I wasn't allowed to go near the window, I wasn't allowed to do anything because my mother was afraid I would be caught. And at this point, a woman came to see us. They used to bring milk. Not in, you know, it wasn't milk in stores like you buy it now, but we would have somebody from the country who would bring the milk. And this was a young woman, a young Christian woman, who had a cart and a horse, and she would have the big vats of milk on the back, and you'd come downstairs and she would measure the milk and buy it from her. And this woman had been an orphan, and my mother made her a wedding dress when she got married, and she never forgot. So she came to see my mother, and she says, listen, where's the child? And she said, shh, I'm hiding her. See, she knew my mother married a Jew. And so she says, give me the child, I'll take her to the country, and I'll hide her for you, because she's not safe here. So my mother told me, look, you're going to the country, and you're going to be able to play outside, and there's animals, and sunshine, and you can run around, and it will be wonderful. And I was very happy, and I hopped onto this cart with her, a little wooden bench on the cart, And I even got to hold the reins of the horse for a while, and off we went to her farm. Her farm was in a village, and outside the village there was like a hill, and her house was on top of the hill, and to the left there was a stable with a stall for a horse and one for the cow, and above it was like an attic area, you know, and the eaves going straight down. And in those days they didn't have hay bales. They would throw the hay up, you know. And we get to this farm, and she makes me get off the cart, and she says, "You're going to live here." And I said, "What do you mean? Why can't I go to your house?" She says, "No, you don't understand. If my neighbors find you, they're going to kill you." And this idea of death is very odd. I mean, none of you can think of death rationally. I'm 77 and I still haven't got my head around it. Imagine a less than 5-year-old child being told somebody wants to kill her. I mean, I didn't believe her. And I was kind of upset that I had to stay in this attic. And we went up on these rickety stairs, and there was a lot of hay. And she told me if anybody came, I was supposed to scooch under the hay and hide and not even be there. I wasn't supposed to yell. I wasn't supposed to go outside in case the neighbors saw me. And I remember the first night was really bad. It was dark, and I was crying and crying and crying because I've never been alone. I've never been alone at night, and there were big black spiders everywhere, and they really scared me. And I was really, really upset, and I cried and cried and cried. And eventually I got used to being there, because you get used to things, you know. You get used to being uncomfortable, you get used to being lonely, you get used to staying in the dark alone. And I even made friends with one of the spiders, and I took a piece of thread and I tied it onto his leg, and he became my pet. And then the leg came off. And then I felt so guilty. I mutilated my friend. And Elizabeth, her name was Elizabeth, this lady, she would come at night and bring me food, and sometimes she smuggled me out of the attic to go to her house to have a bath when there was nobody around. And I was there several months, and one day there was a loud commotion